Hi, folks. Ryan Honeyman here from Lift Economy. Many folks have come to us over the last 10 years and asked, how do I get more involved in creating an economy that works for the benefit of all life? They also ask, what skills and experiences do I need to help make this transition? So 3 years ago, we created something called the Next Economy MBA to help address this and similar questions. Lift Economy's Next Economy MBA is an online course that's designed for entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs, students, recent graduates, employees, and folks who want to learn more about transformational Next Economy strategies and businesses. Join the growing alumni network of nearly 250 alumni who've gone through this program and learned essential skills and hopefully built lifelong relationships for catalyzing businesses in the emergent and regenerative economy. So we encourage you to check out our course. You can go to lifteconomy.com/MBA. The next course, Cohort 7, starts on September 21st, 2021. So once again, go to www.lifteconomy.com/MBA. And now, on with the show. Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
Jennifer, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Ryan. Nice to be here.
So Jennifer, tell us a little bit about your background. What were you doing before you got into the mission-aligned philanthropy space?
I have been working for about 20 years in philanthropy and grassroots development work in Africa. When I applied for the position with Swift Foundation, I was applying for a managing director position and really was applying based on my programmatic experience, making cross-border international grants to communities. It became apparent after about 6 months to a year on the job that the board really saw this position as one in which all of our assets needed to be deployed towards the mission, and that included investments as well as grants. So I began the journey 6 years ago of learning about how Swift Foundation could deploy our resources, all of our resources, towards making a better world. And that included PRIs, our investment dollars, and our grant dollars.
Great. And maybe just for folks who don't know about the Swift Foundation, could you give us a brief background of what it is and why it was started?
Swift Foundation is a small family foundation that was started about 15 years ago by John Swift, and in 2011 received an influx of capital. It's based on legacy UPS stock, and the focus has always been on the intersection of biological diversity and cultural diversity. So we really focus on supporting land stewards, land and water stewards that protect the environment and that create local resilient economies. So you can see how we would be very interested in how our investment portfolio was affecting Indigenous peoples and biodiversity around the world.
Yeah, perhaps. So what are some of the projects that you guys are working on right now?
So Swift funds in a variety of regions. We focus on the Andes Amazon, in Native communities in the United States, British Columbia, and some work in Africa. We don't fund projects per se. What we fund is we fund organizations that are doing ongoing work in the communities as partners, or some of the organizations are Indigenous led. So one example of a group that we're funding is a group called Asociación Andes. They're based in Peru, in the Cusco area, and they work with a community on supporting the community to develop and support biodiversity in potatoes. It's called the Potato Park. And there they cultivate over 1,200 varieties of potatoes and cultivate and reseed those and distribute those in the community. So they're very important center of biodiversity, but they also emphasize the cultural basis of the potato as well as a spiritual basis. So it's a very integrated approach to supporting this biodiversity in the landscape. Asociación Andes has been working for over 20 years on this work, and they're now developing and expanding it through learning exchanges with other communities around the world that are trying to start biodiversity parks very similar to them.
Phenomenal. So Jen, what are some of the biggest successes you guys have had to date?
So Swift was an early investor in Guayaquil sustainable rainforest products, both with loans and equity. And for those of your listeners who don't know, Guayaquil pays a premium for yerba tea leaves grown under trees native to the rainforest. And this is a different way of producing as opposed to clear cutting forests to produce plantation style yerba mate. So the whole thesis of the organization is to produce a high quality yerba mate and avoid and reverse the destruction of the rainforest. What's amazing about this investment is Swift invested in it a good almost 10 years ago now, 10 to 12 years ago now. And to see Guayaki sold in major grocery stores today when it was just a very small fledgling company all those years ago is a huge win for the rainforest, for the producers of yerba mate, and for consumers. Because Guayaki is a profitable and growing company. And they've built their business based on ecological and social principles. And they haven't been bought out by a huge company yet. We see so much consolidation in the organic food business. So it's really it's a wonderful story. And I think the lesson for me, this predated my involvement at Swift, is that good companies that have strong values and a good business model, it takes time for them to mature and grow and to get that shelf space in major grocery stores. The one other success that I'd like to mention, which is more of a success of mindset, is Swift Foundation has been funding RSF Social Finance's PRI Food Fund, which is now called the Food System Transformation Fund. And one of the things that they've been funding are small loans of $75,000 to $200,000 to food entrepreneurs in the United States that are providing healthy food or processing food, or they're farmers themselves. And one of the things they've learned is that they need both technical assistance money, loan financing, and grant capital for these smaller businesses to get going. And so RSF Social Finance asked Swift for grant money for integrated capital approach to their portfolio. And now it is a big part of how RSF Social Finance looks at the field. And I think for Swift, it's not a question of making profits, but it's knowing, one, that we're recirculating money into new businesses all of the time that are creating a healthier food economy. And secondly, that the benefits are wide and long lasting. And that many times we need to invest grant capital to build the infrastructure in order for those loans to actually be used. So entrepreneurs need technical assistance, they need time, and they also need the expertise to figure out what kinds of funding do they really need in order to get them through the next growth stage.
Wow. What about in the United States? Are there any organizations that are working on projects that you're particularly excited about?
Yeah, we support a variety of organizations, and they're doing different things in the U.S. It's not in one geography. For example, we're supporting a CDFI called Native Home Access that Dave Castillo works with, and they're doing loans to Native American community development organizations, such as the Santo Domingo Pueblo that has recently built low-income housing and a community center. And they're also doing some other work with access to healthy foods there. Another group that we support is Honor the Earth, led by Winona LaDuke, which does a lot of work around advocacy in Minnesota with pipelines and trying to ensure a more sustainable approach to development in that area and on their reservation.
One of the projects that I know you guys work on is with the folks at Tonka Bar. At Lift Economy, we're huge fans of them. And maybe just for folks who don't know, could you talk about the Tonka folks and what Swift Foundation is doing to support their work?
Certainly. We've been supporting Tonka now for about 5 or 6 years. We're one of many supporters, investors, and donors to the fund, along with several Native American tribes, Northwest Area Foundation, Clearinghouse CDFI. And the wonderful thing about Mark Tilson and Carlene Hunter at Native American Natural Foods is they've taken a native recipe called wasna, which is buffalo meat and cranberry, and they've modified it slightly to make this really high protein, low fat, very healthy snack food that's really available now across the country. And it's based on a native recipe, and they're doing their production in Kyle, South Dakota on the Pine Ridge Reservation. And it's really quite an inspirational story. At the same time, it's a challenging market as well. The snack food market has a lot of pressure in it, and they're working hard to maintain the quality of their product and their market niche.
Yeah, it's definitely heating up with the entry of folks like Epic Bar and Crave. It's pretty interesting to see the a little bit of overt or sort of direct or indirect cultural appropriation of the buffalo, from larger multinational companies. And so hopefully really want to see Tonka succeed in this.
Yeah, I mean, I have to be really honest. It's really challenging and disappointing to see the cultural appropriation of basically a sector that Tonka initiated and started. And frankly, it's heartbreaking. I'm going to be really honest. When you look at the other products, most of them are not 100% buffalo. They're mixed in with pork and turkey. They're using native symbols, and they don't have native commitment to the native ranchers or to native staff. So it's really a big challenge, and they have huge financial backing, both of those companies. That's way beyond anything that Tonka has had. So you can't see that as a consumer, perhaps, but it's really it's been a really challenging road on a lot of levels.
Yeah, I mean, one other piece on Native American natural foods in Tonka is, how do you find the argument that some of the other buffalo bar companies might make around, well, we're doing regenerative ag, sort of holistic grazing, and we're sequestering carbon. I think that's definitely one of the marketing approaches. Do you see, I guess, how do you view that in the context of the cultural piece? Do you feel the environmental piece of having more regeneratively sourced buffalo sort of makes it okay? Or I'm just kind of curious of that balance.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really a tough question. The market is generally very excited about, renewable energy and this, renewable ag through ranching and buffalo. And, I'm not a buffalo ranching expert, so I have to say this, but the questions that, are often posed are, so where are you getting your buffalo meat from? And most of the ranchers are white ranchers. There are not many Native Americans. So my question would be to those companies, well, you're making great profits. How are you helping Native ranchers get access to buffalo herds and enabling them to actually ranch? I mean, one of the stats, and I don't have it off the top of my head, that Mark Tilson always cites, is that it's a tragedy that most Native reservations are being ranched by white cattle ranchers on long-term leases. And we know that cattle is subsidized by USDA policies and procedures. And there are a lot of barriers to entry for Native ranchers. And we need to start looking at that, because it's not just a question of, well, we're doing a more sustainable ranching. Who is benefiting from it? So I would want to ask those questions, those equity questions that often are the last ones to be asked.
And you also mentioned that Swift Foundation is an investor and a donor. And I think you had mentioned there's some unique structures of the way that Swift Foundation functions. Could you maybe speak to that a little bit about how Swift Foundation differs from other foundations? Sure.
I think one of the things is all foundations, or not all foundations, but many foundations are trying to use many tools in their toolbox. And, one of the ways that we talk about is integrated capital, using both grant capital and investment capital. But Swift does have a fairly unique setup in that we decided that of our $60 million endowment, $50 million was going to be set aside as a core endowment to basically earn market rate returns so that we could kick off our grants every year, a grants budget of about $2 million, but that the $10 million would be an impact investing transitional portfolio that was really focused on environmental and social return first, and that market returns were the secondary focus. And within that $10 million fund, it's divided into 3 pools, and it's sort of a risk allocation approach, but we fund mutual funds of funds. So it might be a group like RSF Social Finance that is funding many different food entrepreneurs. And the second category we have is direct investments in a single company, which would be like Native American natural foods. And the third area we have is for angel investments, which are smaller investments that require less due diligence, but we think are really visionary and really don't have the wherewithal, or we don't have the wherewithal as a small foundation to do a huge financial due diligence package. And that seems to be, that's one of the huge barriers to entry in this whole field, is smaller entrepreneurs really providing all of the financial data that many investors need, and whether or not the transaction cost is so high to make some of these loans or investments that it knocks them out of the category. And in fact, some of these loans are absolutely critical to building the field. So we try to have a diverse approach to it in order to make the biggest difference.
I know that one of the founders, Sonia, is involved in resource generation and the folks around looking at the corpus of many foundations and what those are invested. I'm curious, with the 50 million that are invested in market rate investments, how do you really balance creating quote unquote impact with publicly traded? Is it like mutual funds, or I'm just kind of curious how you approach the 50 million in order to generate enough returns for the grant making?
Right. So we have a financial advisor, Manchester Capital, that has chosen, I think it's about 5 or 6 different mutual fund companies, such as Walden Asset Management, Boston Common Asset Management, Trillium, Parametric. There are others. They have been given very specific no-buy guidelines to develop their portfolio in various areas, whether it's a small cap stock portfolio, a domestic large cap, or global. And our no-buy guidelines are very specific around coal and nuclear power, genetically modified organisms, synthetic agrochemicals, old-growth timber, nuclear weapons, and anti-personnel weapons, armaments, and ammunition. In addition, we, have our sensors up for human rights violations and can ask any of those fund managers to drop a company due to human rights abuses. But we've been quite happy with how they've been able to move our portfolio forward. The one other aspect, which has been very exciting, and Sonia, I know, is particularly excited about it, is that we've had several positions in our transitional portfolio that have performed at market rate for several years, and that are safe investments that also have a very high social and environmental alignment and impact. And we've actually been able to move those into the core portfolio. And we're hoping to slowly populate the core portfolio with more of these positions. And the particular one that I'm thinking of right now is Microvest, which does microfinance in the developing world and is a wonderful investment, and also is a really great fund.
That's interesting. I've never heard of Microvest. I'll have to check them out, especially if it's performing well. I'm curious, you have a unique insight into the world of foundations from your consulting work with foundations and also just being in the field for 20 years. And I think to many entrepreneurs and folks outside the foundation world, it can sometimes feel like there's sort of this monolithic foundation that you're sort of applying to talk to. But I'm curious, like maybe just from your general experience working in the space, what about challenges? Like, what are the things that the foundations think about? What are the top 2 to 3 challenges that you have found in your work over the last 20 years? Are there certain things that continually pop up that foundations fret about that keeps up their executive directors at night?
There's a variety of things depending on where you are. I think, at the end of the day, foundations are trying to deploy their resources in the most effective and strategic way possible. And many foundations are human resource strapped, which is a big problem, frankly. The more time that we have as foundations to interact with people that are soliciting grants, investments, et cetera, from us, the more time we have to interact with the field, the better we are at our jobs. So being a small staff foundation is a really big challenge. And for me, the basis of good grant making and good investing, frankly, is building a relationship and really spending the time to get to know the management. And I think that's been the one thing, when I translate my skills from primarily, I have a background in cultural anthropology. I got my PhD studying in West Africa. The most important thing that I've learned from studying alongside MBAs and entrepreneurs is learning and finding out about how management works is the most important thing, which is not so different from looking at an NGO or a community-based organization. You really want to understand how they're making their decisions on what value basis. And I think that's, getting time with a foundation to explain what your philosophy is and how you work. To me, that's absolutely critical. A lot of people are focused on the outputs, on we're going to do this, that, and the other thing. It's very pie in the sky. And I'm a realist, and I know things take time. And businesses as well as nonprofits hit hard times. And the question is, how's the leadership and how are the staff going to respond to those situations and communicate about them?
Yeah, it reminds me of when I've heard venture capitalists speak about what do they like to invest in. They always say the team. It sounds like that resonates with you as well.
So I would say it's more than the team. It's also the way the team thinks, the way the management is. It's the how of the work. So if I'm doing a good job, I'm building a relationship and seeing how the team does and what's their bottom line. I recently spoke to one of the partners at Renewal Funds, and she talked about one of the companies that they've invested in on the East Coast in Pennsylvania. Their factory burned down, and they make ready to make pizza crusts, organic pizza crusts. And the company founders kept all the employees on for 6 months and paid them while that factory was being rebuilt. And she said that was a huge indicator to us that that company is going to have highly loyal employees and that they really care about their employees. And to me, that was, that's not something where you can check a box or fill in a number on B Labs or Gears, but it says something about that management and their relationship to their employees.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I love the nuance of how they think rather than just like the team. It's not just like look at the resumes, but how they interact with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Is there too many things to look at any one time, and so you have to necessarily screen out potential grantees, or what about like sort of the volume? Can you speak a little bit to like the volume of proposals and et cetera, and how that affects your work?
Certainly. Yeah, the volume of proposals is huge. There's a million good ideas out there. There are a million great people out there. We're a really small foundation, and that's why we don't take unsolicited proposals. Most of our proposals and ideas come through our colleagues, some of them do receive unsolicited proposals. So we are in a network of relationships and are always looking for new projects and ideas. And we actually fund quite a bit of new and early innovators. And we find them through meetings and through our networks, et cetera. I think, the most important thing for someone who's trying to approach a foundation is to try to find a trusted relationship, to get an introduction. I will look at something where somebody says, hey, Jen, I know these folks or I've met them and I think it would be of interest to you. If I have an introduction from a trusted colleague, it makes me look twice than something where it's just a complete cold call. I do look at the cold calls too, but there is only so much that we can read and follow up on.
Yeah, it seems like it's the way the world works, right? Who do you know that... A trusted intro is definitely, I think it's for a lot of things, getting jobs, and definitely it sounds like getting, it just helps us weed out the fluff.
Right.
Yeah.
At the same time, I would say I'm constantly looking at where do I spend my time? And because we focus on Indigenous peoples, they tend to be more soft-spoken, don't use I'll just put in quotes, the Western ways of solicitation. So I do really try to set aside time to reach out to our Indigenous partners and ask them, do they have leads? And to ensure that a certain percentage of the things that I'm looking at do focus on Native businesses and Native grants. And that's really important to us. So that's something that I'm thinking about. For other folks, the equity issues may be, and we look at marginalized communities as well, but equity issues are really important in this field, and we have a lot of hidden biases and unseen biases that we need to really address and proactively address.
You've probably seen so many grant proposals over the years. What are the top 2 to 3 things that most people submitting a grant proposal miss? Like, what are those like, oh, they didn't do this, or even on the flip side, like, what are the ones that you're really excited about? What do they have that the other ones are missing? Kind of curious your thoughts on that.
I think enthusiasm and passion is really critical. So I want to know why somebody is starting something or doing something. I like to know people's story. Of course, that's not something you're going to necessarily put in a letter, an application, but commitment is really important. And frankly, you don't work 15-hour days if you're not super committed. So understanding why someone is motivated to do some of these crazy things, start a crazy business that's going to try to change the world or start a nonprofit, really getting clear on that is important. The other thing that's really important is, why is what they're doing unique? Isn't there another organization doing this, or how are they doing it differently? Or should they be tweaking something else? When someone can convince me that 1, they're doing something very unique that isn't being done before, 2, they have the passion to do it, and 3, I guess the third thing is, how are they a member of the community? How have they engaged with their community to have a high degree of participation and engagement around the idea? So, for a businessman, that would be your consumer. Do you know your consumer? Are they motivated and excited by your product? That was one thing that Native American Natural Foods really hit home with us. They had this incredible consumer base based all on the internet and Facebook and tweeting, which was just incredible. And they had testimony of that. But I look for that in nonprofits as well. Is the community demanding their services and what they're looking for? So those would be the three things.
Very good. I love that, especially the why. I think so many people just get straight to like the what they're doing as opposed to framing the larger picture. Very helpful. Here's an interesting question for you. If you could play benevolent dictator for a day, is there a legal one policy or legal rule you would change to dramatically increase the flow of philanthropic capital to more mission-aligned organizations?
Wow. I thought I was going to get in the USDA and change how we cost account for food, which I would really love to. I'd love to address at the corporate level the impact of pesticides and fertilizers on our water and the health of our soils and the health of the food system. But for the foundation community, so it's interesting. I think the community tends to set the bar, I would say, a little low in terms of our payout and in terms of our investments. And I recently had a conversation at the board around the PRIs as being part of the 5% payout. I guess I would say I don't think PRIs should be part of the 5% payout. Personally, I think that in order to release more capital, I think actually we should be investing alongside our mission statements. If that was a requirement, things would change dramatically. And I mean, there's this big debate around whether or not foundations should sunset or not, and whether they should remain in perpetuity. I think it's a false debate or discussion. If we're really interested in transforming the world, we only have what we have today. New capital and wealth is created all the time because it's kind of the nature of capitalism. If we could mobilize all of our assets and invest in businesses and companies that were changing the world for the better, that were mission aligned, I think that would be a huge revolution in philanthropy. So it's not a specific rule. I mean, it's around the PRIs, I guess, but there's a lot of other pieces that need to back up to make that happen. I'm not big on the benevolent dictator question, but I understand the idea of how can we get more resources flowing. I mean, to be honest, I think the biggest shift that I'd like to see is there's a lot of business people, MBAs, young, excited people coming into the field that want to harness philanthropic capital. What I don't see as much from within the field and from within the side of the social sciences, so I come from anthropology, is enough interest in learning about the business side of things. And I really feel like our programs are divorced from our investments. And until we break through that mindset that you're a program person and you have no connection to investments, it's just not true. We are all invested. We all have individual retirement accounts. I hope we're all invested in the future. Through the way our financial system's set up. And I would just hope that foundations could recognize that our financial system is one of the key constraints to creating a more equitable and environmentally and socially sustainable society or a community. And frankly, the current economic system is just, it's killing us, and it's terribly destructive. And I think that it's at the basis of much transformation.
You mentioned something that I find fascinating, the discussion around whether foundations should, I think the term is sunset, or does that mean basically like spend all their assets and go away? Is that basically what sunsetting means?
Yes, that's sunsetting.
Okay. And you mentioned it's a false argument almost. I'm kind of curious, is your position like something like the Blank Foundation that say got 500 million or something? Is it still benefiting society to have that same 500 million just sort of invested in market rate returns without, like, what if all the foundations had to spend their money within 5 years? Do you think the world would be better, or how do you really see that argument playing out?
Yeah, I'm not a big person on like, we've all got to sunset or we've all got to spend our money. I think the flip side, what we really need to look at and understand more specifically as an industry, a philanthropic industry, and I'll just, take it from there. There's 77,000 foundations. Most of those are $10 million or less. That's like, 2/3 of the foundations are small, have $10 million in assets or less. And the bigger question for me is, who's benefiting from this 5% payout and perpetuity? And my understanding is it's the money managers. So it's the financial institutions and the money managers. It's the accountants and the lawyers that are benefiting from that. What is our mission? Our mission is not to benefit those three groups. Our mission is to benefit Usually people from marginalized communities, low and moderate income communities, immigrants, young people, people who are sick, who need medicine, who need new cures, who need education, who need health care. I mean, that's our mission. It's not to benefit the financial industry. And so I think we just need to be very skeptical and ask hard questions. I think the Swift Foundation has found a really good approach for where they are now because there's strong support on the board for perpetuity and there's strong support for really being a visionary in terms of our investments. And I think it's a great way to move forward. You don't have to sunset or be in perpetuity. There's a lot of room in the middle there. And frankly, in 2008, when we had the crash, a lot of foundations cut back their grants dramatically because they thought they were going to go out of business if they continued to spend at that rate. One of the interesting points is if you had your money in alternative investments and in community-based development finance institutions, you didn't lose as much and you didn't have as much volatility. So in the end, are we, are our investments in these, go-go, hyper inflated investments, or are they in long-term investments that are really supporting our local communities the way most of our missions are focused on?
Are there folks in your field, cutting edge thought leaders or foundations or other philanthropists that you look to as saying they're really leading, in addition to Swift, because we know you guys are awesome, are there other folks that you look to as thought leaders that are sort of leading the next economy?
Yeah, there are so many when I think about it. I'm really excited about the work going on at IDEX and Thousand Currents with the Buen Vivir Fund, which is a collaboration between donors and grassroots organizations to invest funds in the regenerative economy. So Joanna Levitt-Say is leading that. I'm also really thrilled with the work that Ellen Dorsey at the Wallace Global Fund is doing with Divest Invest, working on renewable energy and social justice. And they're launching a new initiative, I think, next week. Marty Thompson of the Fund for Democratic Communities has been working with Jennifer Neer of Shake the Foundations on some really interesting models around community ownership, which I think is super important and I think a very underrepresented topic in our field. And then, I'll just mention a few others. Joel Solomon of Renewal Funds, I think, is just tremendous. Andrea Armeni of Transform Finance. Jonathan Lewis, he's a board member of Opportunity Collaboration, really has a lot to say to social entrepreneurs, and Woody Tash of Slow Money. And I mentioned the last 4 or 5 of those because they all have either books coming out or they've written a lot. So they're really great resources.
It sounds like an ideal podcast guest list for us. So thank you for, we've already had Joel and Andrea Armeni on the show. So
oh, fantastic.
Yeah, I'd love to speak to some of the other people too. What's the book you most often give as a gift?
Oh my goodness, that's a good one. So I'm kind of a serial reader, so I usually pass on the last book that I've read. So there can't be a most often book that I've read, but I will just say the most recent book that I've read that totally floored me was a book called Homegoing, and I've forgotten the woman's name. It's just a heartbreaking story about slavery. And it follows a family in Ghana and in the United States. I was just at the Confluence Philanthropy meeting in New Orleans and was able to visit the Whitney Plantation and really get educated, frankly, about U.S. slavery in a much more deep and personal way. And having studied in West Africa, it's just what's on my mind right now. I think we have a deep issue around equity and racism in our country, and we're on a learning journey, and I have a lot to learn anyhow. So I really encourage people to visit the Whitney Plantation and to read Homegoing and to look at equity in their portfolio and in their work.
It looks like the author is Yaa Gyasi, Yagyasi, for folks who are interested.
Yes.
Let's see, last few questions here. What do you need? How can listeners support Swift Foundation? Do you guys have events or collaborations or, things investments that folks can help bring attention to, like Native American natural foods? What are some of the things that listeners can do to support your work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm really interested in looking for allies who are mobilizing grants, investments, and leadership. There's one project that we started to fund with Sergio Osharansky of Yansa. He's based in Mexico City, but he's working with Liz Hoskin of the Gaia Foundation in London on a new platform to address human rights abuses and community participation in renewable energy work. It's called Ojusu, OJUSO. It hasn't launched yet, but we are looking for collaborators, both folks that know of really good renewable energy programs and projects and investments, as well as ones that are falling down. And Sergio has been working in renewable wind in the Oaxaca region of Mexico and has really come across a lot of the problems in mid-size wind energy. And we're really interested in trying to invest in that area, but have been having difficulty with it. I'm also interested in networking with folks that are doing great work on improving the food system. And I'm involved in a couple different initiatives. One's called the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. You can find their website, as well as the Agroecology Fund, that are really trying to look at the true cost of food and really bring the value of agroecology, both the employment opportunities that it provides, as well as the social and environmental opportunities that it provides, and health value to the world. So I'm always looking for collaborators and folks to work with, and very interested to hear from the listeners if they have questions about what we're doing.
Yeah, and where can folks go to learn more about Swift Foundation and learn more about your work?
So we do have a website, www.swiftfoundation.org. I will just let you know that we are doing a major overhaul of our website right now. And in about 6 weeks, we will have a brand new website up. We'll have a lot of information on our new one, including all of our current investments, which I think number about 29. So that's in the transition portfolio, as well as a list of all of our current grantee partners and their websites. So unfortunately, the current website doesn't have as much information as we'd like. But if you can be patient and remember it in a couple of weeks here, we'll have a lot of information.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.